All right, so how the heck did the Samoans get so incredibly fat? Yeah, no, I understand. From the moment you clicked on this video, that was probably a wild line to start with, but it is actually a genuine question that needs to be answered. And personally, I gotta say, my friends, I'm just so incredibly tired of making so many videos about taking demographic time bombs and government corruption and horrible conflicts and so much more. Oh dear God, we have gone through a lot, and there is still so much to cover. And I mean, me saying, oh, I'm tired is probably the wrong word. We absolutely, again, have so much more that we do have to cover, but we've been on such a dark and serious trend of late that I wanted to do something a little bit, I don't know, silly, I guess you could say. Hence today's episode, we're going to be looking at a political state that somehow, over the span of just like 2 generations, became the most obese on the freaking planet. Now, how high of an obesity rate are we talking, you may wonder? Well, hear me out on this. American Samoa has one of the highest obesity rates in the entire world, with estimates suggesting that around 75% to up to 95% of all adults are overweight or obese. And the roots of this crisis is something that stretches back through a complex intertwining web of genetics, colonial history, economic transformations, etc., etc. In fact, what is so crazy is that if you go back and look at a list of the most obese countries on Earth, you will find that most of the top 10 are Pacific Ocean island nations. But why? Well, my friends, as always here on the History of Everything podcast, we have to look back to the past in order to be able to answer the present. And in this case, understanding how this happened requires tracing several centuries of Samoan life and the disruptions that were imposed upon it. So with that being said, let's dive right in. My friends, speaking of security and all kinds of problems and everything else that we've been going over, a while ago, I actually sat down and read what my email provider is allowed to do with my inbox, which I know sounds strange to just say, but I made a new email account that very same night, and you're going to understand why. The reason for that is, well, here's the thing. Every single email that hits your inbox is something that gets scanned. And I know the response that you're probably going to have, oh, I don't have anything to hide. I like personalized ads or something like that. I don't know, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not the argument. It's not about, hiding anything. The issue is that 4 or 5 companies pretty much get to decide whatever it is that you see, what gets recommended, what is your version of the internet even going to look like. And that's not really a preference, that's a structural problem. So that's actually why I started working with and then moved to Proton Mail, because from the very get-go, things kind of shocked me. Like I could go and open a newsletter and it would tell me that it just blocked 3 trackers in one email from a company, even one that I like. That's a big deal. But this right here is the feature that got me. I've needed to sign up to a series of different websites for research for my videos because go figure, I cover a lot of different things, but I hate getting spammed, and I get spammed a lot by different stuff. That's no longer really a problem now, as I could just make a burner address on the spot for a site. We're talking a real inbox with a fake identity. If it leaks, I can just delete it and it's gone. That is really it. Not to mention, Proton is end-to-end encrypted. Not even Proton itself can read my inbox, which makes it completely private. Now, I know when I'm talking about this, it all sounds like a lot. I get it. But the thing is, you don't have to blow up your whole life to do this. Easy Switch is something that will go and pull in all my old emails and contacts in about 4 minutes. I can then send from my old address inside Proton, so nothing really breaks. You just stop feeding the machine, if you will, at your own pace. With this, you can break up with big tech, my friends, and if you want to know more, links down in the description. You can go to proton.me/history of everything, and my inbox is actually something that feels like mine again. It's awesome. Anyway, back to the show. Now, first things first, in order to understand what is going on with Samoan bodies, you need to understand the way that they formed in the first place. You have to start roughly 3,000 years ago with the Lapita people, the seafaring ancestors of modern Polynesians who had spread out around the region around Taiwan and the Bismarck Archipelago and would push eastward into the vast empty Pacific. Samoa was something that was settled around 3,000 years ago and became one of the great cradles of Polynesian civilization, the launching point from which voyagers would be able to reach Tahiti, Hawaii, what would become New Zealand, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, which that's what that is. I just repeated myself there. You get the idea of what it is I'm talking about. The crucial thing to grasp here is the sheer brutality of these voyages as a kind of evolutionary filter, if you will. Voyagers would set out in double-hulled canoes across thousands of kilometers of open ocean with really no guarantee of actually being able to find land. They faced starvation, dehydration, prolonged cold exposure at sea, along with a whole host of other issues. And so under those conditions, natural selection, with time, would relentlessly favor individuals whose bodies could store energy efficiently, survive long periods without food, and maintain core body temperature. A person who could pack on fat reserves during time of plenty and then burn through them slowly during a month-long voyage or a famine on a newly settled island. This is something that would have a dramatically higher chance of surviving and then being able to reproduce, thus carrying those same traits. Basic natural selection. Over many generations of this filtering, the Polynesian populations that emerged would carry a genetic architecture that was optimized for energy conservation and fat storage. This is, when we're going and describing this, the deep biological foundation upon which everything else was later built. But oh dear boy, was this was built. But to explain that, we then need to dive into a little science that first, I will say this. Normally, I would have my wife, the molecular biologist, go and explain this part, but she is actually away on a girls' trip at this point. So I will do my best when talking about genes and genetics. To explain this in a history sense, the thrifty gene hypothesis is something that was first proposed back in 1962 by a geneticist called James Neal, who was actually trying to explain diabetes. His idea was that certain populations would evolve genes that made them extremely efficient at storing energy as fat during times of abundance, which was then protective during famine, but catastrophic in a modern world of constant caloric surplus, where there's just food, the likes of which the world had never seen in history. The gene that saved your ancestors is now something that would kill you because it keeps signaling your body to store fat when there's no famine coming, because you can always just go to McDonald's, I guess. Now, for decades, this was largely theoretical for Pacific populations. But as it turns out, in the year 2016, there was a landmark study that was published in Nature Genetics that gave it a concrete molecular basis. Researchers, led by teams studying Samoan populations, would identify a variant of a gene called CREBRF, or CREB3 regulatory factor. This specific variant, known as, I'm going to list a whole bunch of numbers here right now with letters, RS373863828, or the A allele, which, again, we'll put all this up here so that you can see what it is I'm talking about. This is a remarkably common thing in, you guessed it, Samoans, present in roughly a quarter to nearly half of the entire population, depending on the sample. At the same time, it is essentially absent in European, African, and most Asian populations. This makes it one of the most population-specific obesity-associated variants that has ever been discovered. Now, what the variant does at the cellular level is actually kind of fascinating, and it's also somewhat of a paradox. It appears to reprogram how fat cells would go and handle energy, because cells carrying the variant would store more fat and use less energy, and so from that, they are more thrifty at the cellular level, which is why it's the thrifty gene hypothesis. Carriers of the variant have a substantially higher body mass index, roughly 1.4 kilograms per copy of the allele on average. But here then is the paradox part, because despite storing more fat, the variant is actually associated with a lower risk of type 2 diabetes relative to the amount of fat stored. The hypothesis is that the variant actually helps fat get stored safely in fat tissue rather than spilling over into things like the liver, the muscle, the bloodstream, etc., where it causes more insulin resistance and other issues. So the gene is genuinely a thrifty survival adaptation. It was amazing for surviving voyages and famines and things like that when food is inconsistent, but in a modern food environment, it drives larger body size. It's important to stress that genetics, what we're talking about here, is a predisposition. It's not guaranteed. It's not destiny. The gene, if you will, loads the gun, but the modern food environment is what pulls the trigger. Without the flood of cheap, ultra-processed calories that we've described here before, the gene would simply have produced robust, healthy people rather than an obesity epidemic. So, okay, that is the genetic background done here, but we haven't exactly explained how we got to this point yet. So we need to go back and explain exactly how Samoan society factored into all of this. See, before Western contact, Samoan society, or Fa Samoa, the Samoan way, was something that was organized around the Aiga, the extended family, and the Matai, the chief system. From here, life was something that was intensely physical. That is, everything that you do, and this is common in subsistence societies. The traditional diet was built on starchy root crops and tree crops. You had taro, which was like the staple, giant swamp taro, breadfruit, yams, bananas, plantains, coconut in all its forms, sugarcane, etc. And then you got protein that primarily came from the sea, like reef fish, deep sea fish, shellfish, octopus, sea turtles, historically. And then also at the same time, you would get pigs and chickens that were raised for feasts. Coconut cream was a rich fat source, and a signature dish, palosami, was wrapped coconut cream in young taro leaves, which was then baked in the umu, a earth oven of hot stones. And that was what you would typically do. The important thing to note about all this, and the reason I'm going into detail describing it, is that critically, obtaining this food was labor. Men would have to fish from canoes. They would clear and plant plantations on steep terrain. They would harvest breadfruit and coconuts from tall trees and built structures. Women would weave, they would gather, they would prepare food over open fires, they would fish the reefs, etc., etc., etc. There were no engines, no supermarkets, no packaged snacks or anything like that. Caloric intake was arguably matched by enormous caloric expenditure, and the food itself was unprocessed. It was high in fiber, it was free of refined sugars, etc. And so, in this kind of equilibrium, if you will, Samoans did get quite large, yes, but they got large and muscular, not metabolically diseased, not fat, if you will. And that right there is something that is extremely important to mention because Samoans were big. They have always been big. And this is something that became ingrained within the culture of Samoa. The cultural valuation of size is essential to understand, and it's not something that can be overstated at all. In Fa Samoa, a large body, historically, is something that would signify rank, prosperity, health, mana, which is like your spiritual power and prestige, that sort of thing. Chiefs were expected to be physically imposing. Feasting and the ability to provide abundant food was central to societal status. Generosity through food is a core Samoan value. And so if you were a person who was thin, this was bad because that could signal, oh, this is a person that is sick. They are poor. They don't have an ability to command resources or to do anything. They're weak and they would be cold. I say that as the end for it's like natural selection. They're not looked as something that is actually healthy and strong and good. This kind of aesthetic and moral framework in which being big, like bigness equals goodness and health, that was perfectly adaptive in the traditional context of Samoan society. But this is then something that becomes a bit more of a serious complicating factor in the modern era because it means the population did not perceive rising weight as actually being a problem in the way that a Western public health framework does. When health officials tell people that being large can be dangerous, they're pushing against a deeply held cultural conviction that, oh, being large is actually a great thing. It's admirable. It's what you're supposed to do. This is one reason why, to this day, anti-obesity campaigns have struggled so much in the Pacific Islands. Anyway, once again, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. The geopolitical story of all of this begins in the late 19th century, when the Samoan archipelago became the object of a three-way imperial rivalry between the United States, the German Empire, and Great Britain. Now, all three wanted Pago Pago Harbor, which is one of the finest deepwater natural harbors in the entire South Pacific, being a drowned volcano crater that provides sheltered deep anchorage that is ideal for coaling and naval stations in the age of steam. And the rivalry is something that nearly led to a war and was punctuated by a dramatic 1889 cyclone in the Apia Harbor that ended up actually wrecking German and American warships that had been in a tense standoff. So, things kind of happened. That rivalry, though, ended up getting resolved by the Tripartite Convention of 1899, which would partition Samoa. Germany would take the western islands, Upolu and Savaii, the larger landmass, which became German Samoa, then a New Zealand-administered territory after World War I when Germany lost all its colonies, which then became independent Samoa in 1962. The United States, on the other hand, would take the eastern islands, Tutuila, Anuu. I know I'm going to mispronounce a whole bunch of these, and I apologize for that. And besides that, the Manua group, which became American Samoa, and that's where that originates from. Britain would withdraw its own claims in exchange for concessions elsewhere in the Pacific and Africa, and then in 1900 and 1904, the local Samoan chiefs of the Eastern Islands would sign deeds of cession, formally ceding their islands to the United States. The U.S. Navy would administer the territory from 1900 until 1951, running essentially the whole thing as just an appendage of the naval station at Pago Pago. Then, after 1951, administration would pass to the Department of the Interior, where it remains to this day. American Samoa is an unincorporated, unorganized U.S. territory, and its people are U.S. nationals, not automatically citizens. This is a distinct legal status on its own that are free to travel and work in the United States, and that is its own potential can of worms that can be talked about at a later time. But either way, This political arrangement matters enormously to the health story because it locked American Samoa into economic and food supply dependency on the United States, making it a destination for American federal programs and American commercial food products, and set up the cash economy transformation that completely dismantled the traditional, physically active subsistence lifestyle of before. And that is arguably the most crucial part. See, under naval and then interior administration, and especially in the post World War II decades, American Samoa's economy was completely remade. The single biggest engine of change was the arrival of the tuna canneries. As in the 1950s and 1960s, Starkist and Van Camp, which later became Chicken of the Sea, if you're familiar with those and have seen those in the grocery store, they built massive tuna canning operations at Pago Pago, taking advantage of the deep harbor, the U.S. territorial status, which gave duty-free access to the mainland of the U.S. market, and cheap local labor. For decades then, tuna canning was the overwhelming backbone of the private economy, at times accounting for the large majority of private sector employment and a huge share of exports for the islands. Alongside the canneries, the government, when talking about both the local territorial government funded heavily by federal transfers and then also federal jobs, that became the other giant employer. And now the upshot of this was a wholesale shift from subsistence farming and fishing to wage labor. People increasingly worked sedentary or factory jobs for cash, and then they used that cash to buy food rather than having to go grow it themselves or catch it themselves. And that is something that was awesome for them, sort of, in a way at first, but also the steep physical demands of the old life, the daily plantation work, the canoe fishing, the tree climbing, all of that evaporated for a large part of the population. At the same time, cars were imported and became increasingly common, which then replaced most of the walking that people would otherwise do. And this collapse in habitual physical activity is half of the energy balance equation that we were talking about before, that equilibrium. This shift happened incredibly fast, and that, as you could expect, had some effects. But before it is that we get into that here, my friends, there is one thing that I kind of want to address here first. There is a very bitter irony that is worth pausing on. Remember those canneries that I was talking about here before? American Samoa's flagship industry would process enormous quantities of high-quality, lean, healthy tuna. It was fish. It was still good. That is something that could be very easily used, especially for dieting. And they shipped virtually the majority of all of that to the U.S. mainland. The local population, meanwhile, would increasingly eat cheap imported fatty meat and refined starch. The islanders were surrounded by one of the best protein sources on Earth, and they largely just didn't eat it because, well, economic logic would point the fish out and the fatty scraps inwards, which I'm going to need to explain that because I am not kidding here with my description. As the cash economy would take hold and the food supply became import dependent, American Samoa became pretty much a dumping ground for the fattiest, cheapest cuts of meat that wealthy exporting countries normally didn't want. Like, as an example of this, you have turkey tails, which I'm sure the majority of people watching this in the first place have never even heard of in the first place. That is the standout example. The turkey tail is the fatty appendage at the rear of the bird, sometimes called the Pope's nose, the parson's nose, or something like that, that holds the oil gland and is then composed of a very high proportion of fat and skin. Now, in American poultry industries, this is essentially a low-value byproduct. You don't really need it for anything. Producers, though, found a lucrative outlet by exporting turkey tails in bulk to the Pacific Islands, where they became extremely popular. They were cheap, they were extremely calorie and fat dense, they could be grilled, they could be boiled, they could be added to dishes to impart rich flavor into it. Like a single serving of turkey tails could be staggeringly high in fat. Roughly 3/4 of their calories came from fat. And so, over decades, they became embedded in the everyday diet and in feasting culture of Samoa. In fact, consumption in the region rose so dramatically that turkey tails arguably became a symbol of the whole nutrition transition problem. Another one besides turkey tails was mutton flaps, which another name for it is like lamb flaps or sippy in the region. That is another parallel case that came from not America, but rather New Zealand and Australia. These were the fatty belly and rib flap cuts of sheep, which again were fairly low value. They were extremely fatty offcuts that really didn't have much value in their countries of origin. And so New Zealand and Australia would export them in huge volumes to the Pacific, including Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, etc., where they became dietary staples for feasting and daily eating. And like turkey tails, they were enormously fat-laden and cheap. And that's just the meat. There were other imports that compounded the problem. You had white rice, which replaced or supplemented taro and breadfruit as the starch base. You had sugary carbonated soft drinks that became the common drink that were consumed in large quantities. You had canned corned beef and a whole bunch of other canned meats that also became common. Because here's the thing, canned meat, that is something that became a kind of prestige and staple food. Like if you could get canned meat, that meant that you could afford imports that were, of higher quality. And that was a big deal to have. There was also instant noodles, white flour, sugar, etc., processed snacks. All of these things would flood the stores. And so corned beef and mackerel, sardines, etc., that became feast foods, precisely because imported canned goods carried a certain amount of prestige that you didn't really have now with the new modern economy. In fact, when it is that I'm going and talking about all these things, there is a little bit of a funny story here that I want to mention. The turkey tail problem became so politically salient that it triggered an actual trade dispute. Like that is something that happened. But importantly, this happened in independent Samoa, which is the Western nation, not American Samoa. And the contrast between these two is a lot. So independent Samoa actually banned the importation of turkey tails in 2007 as an explicit public health measure to try and fight obesity and heart disease. That ban stayed in place for years, but when Samoa tried to join the World Trade Organization, which it did in 2012, it faced a lot of pressure because a blanket import ban on a very specific product is actually kind of difficult to reconcile with WTO free trade rules, which generally prohibits these exact targeted bans unless they could be rigorously justified on health grounds in a kind of non-discriminatory way. And so as part of its WTO ascension, Samoa agreed to lift the turkey tail ban with a transition period. And instead, they would pursue public health goals through other means like taxation and health education rather than just outright prohibiting something. In the end, this episode kind of becomes a whole famous case study in the tension between free trade rules and public health sovereignty. You have a small nation trying to protect its people from a product that is literally designed to be offloaded as another country's dietary waste, and they find that the rules of global trade constrain their ability to do so. It's a shitty situation no matter what it is that you think. Either way, that was independent Samoa. American Samoa, being a US territory rather than a sovereign WTO member, they operated under different constraints. It couldn't independently ban American food imports in the same way, being economically and politically bound to the US mainland market. And this is part of why the Eastern American territory's food environment remains so incredibly saturated with these highly processed fatty products. So then, another question is why exactly healthier products lost so bad in comparison to these super fatty ones? The answer is, as I kind of mentioned here before, it's quite simple: economics. The economics of a remote island reinforce the junk food trap at basically every kind of turn. Fresh fruits and vegetables and other perishable healthy foods have to largely be imported over long ocean distances, which makes them very expensive and oftentimes poorer quality when it is that they arrive. And because, we're talking about a tropical environment in tropical heat, they spoil rather quickly. On the other hand, calorie-dense processed foods, the white rice, the canned meats, the frozen fatty cuts, sugar, soda, instant noodles, all that stuff, it is cheap, they are shelf-stable, they're easy to ship and store, and they deliver the most calories per dollar. Like, there's really no contest. For a family on a limited income, the rational economic choice is the calorie-dense processed option. Meanwhile, local agriculture would decline as people would leave farming for wage jobs, so even the domestic supply of fresh taro, breadfruit, and other vegetables would shrink, making the population even more dependent on imports. The traditional foods became, in some cases, relatively more expensive and less convenient than the imported junk that displaced it. Federal food assistance and commodity programs would also tend to channel the population more towards the processed and packaged foods that could be readily delivered. Because of all this here, my friends, epidemiologists have a name for what happened to American Samoa: the nutrition transition. The rapid shift that a society undergoes when they go from a traditional diet, from whole foods, high fiber, physically demanding lifestyles, etc., to a Western pattern, something that is filled with more refined carbohydrates, sugar, fats, and a sedentary lifestyle. What makes the Pacific case here, though, so incredibly extreme is the speed, the transition in which it happened. This is something that unfolded over the course of a century or more in most Western nations, and that was instead compressed into roughly a third or half the time, 2 generations in American Samoa. And it landed on a population with the thrifty CREBRF genetic profile that we went into in the beginning, and a culture that values large size. Literally every single factor from the beginning, from the history, from the economics, from the genetics, from all of it, every single factor points in the exact same direction at once. And so, as you can imagine, the health consequences have been devastating. Obesity rates climb to among the highest ever recorded anywhere, with the large majority of adults overweight or obese. Type 2 diabetes became rampant, with associated complications, diabetic neuropathy, retinopathy leading to blindness, kidney failure requiring dialysis, lower limb amputations, which became tragically common. All kinds of horrible things became commonplace. Hypertension and cardiovascular disease, heart attacks and strokes would surge. Gout, driven primarily by diet, is notably prevalent among Pacific populations. The territory faces high rates of these non-communicable diseases with a healthcare system that is limited in its own capacity. Serious cases often have to be medically evacuated to Hawaii or the US mainland, and the chronic disease management like dialysis is something that strains resources enormously for a territory that is not exactly wealthy. Because of this, life expectancy and quality of life are being dragged down by this burden of preventable chronic disease. American Samoa consistently appears at or near the top of global obesity rankings, in the same cluster as its other Pacific island neighbors. Nauru, the Cook Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, etc., all of which have experienced parallel colonial economic and dietary trajectories. From everything it is that we are describing, almost all the cases here are, if not the same, very similar, resulting in a similar outcome. So that's it then. Well, what could be done? Well, efforts to reverse the crisis run into a series of formidable walls of different factors that just reinforce the whole thing. Public health campaigns promote traditional diets, physical activity, and awareness of diabetes, sure, but they push against the cultural valorization of size and feasting and against ingrained habits that have built up over generations at this point. Some measures have targeted sugary drinks and unhealthy imports through taxation, sure, and there have been pushes to revive local agriculture and fishing to try and make fresh food more available and affordable. Diabetes screening and management programs try to catch complications early, which is something that at least helps there to reduce later costs and pain. Yet the underlying drivers, these factors that we've described here before, still persist. Healthy food still remains more expensive and inconvenient relative to cheaper imported calories. Employment remains largely sedentary. The genetic predisposition of the Samoans is not something that you can just change. This is literally a part of their identity. And the cultural meanings that are attached to food and body size is something that shifts very slowly. Feasts remain central to Samoan social and ceremonial life, and they revolve around abundant, rich food. Any intervention that ignores Fa Samoa, the Samoan way, the cultural framework of their society, that tends to fail. Which is why the most thoughtful modern approaches try to work within Samoan values, reframing health in more culturally similar or resonant terms, enlisting matai, the chiefs, and church leaders rather than trying to lecture from the outside, because if there's going to be any change, it's likely to be internal, not external, that is going to make that happen. So then, what's the big picture? In the end here, my friends, the obesity of American Samoa is not the result of any single cause, and it's certainly not an individual failing. It is the convergence of multiple things, a deep evolutionary heritage that would forge fat-conserving bodies that would then go through the trial of ocean voyaging. You have a specific scientifically identified genetic variant, CREBRF, that makes the population unusually prone to storing fat. You have a colonial history that bound the islands to the United States and would dismantle the traditional subsistence economy. And this economic transformation is something that replaced physical labor with sedentary wage work and replaced homegrown food with imports. From there, you have a global trade system that would funnel the fattiest, cheapest waste cuts of the world's rich meat industry, the turkey tails and mutton flaps, etc., straight right into the Pacific diet. And the simple economics of remoteness that Samoa has means that the junk cuts are cheap and the fresh food is actually more dear and expensive. With this, you get a cultural framework in which large body size and lavish feasting are markers of prestige and virtue rather than any kind of warning sign or anything like that. And so all of these different factors, everything that we've described over the course of this video, all of it points in the same direction, arriving at roughly the same time. And it would produce one of the fastest and most severe population-level health transformations in the entirety of modern human history. One that is very unlikely to go back outside of some kind of major disaster occurring, a famine or something along those lines. And so unfortunately, as it stands, that right there is the end of that right now, my friends. Yeah. I said this wasn't going to be necessarily depressing. It's not necessarily depressing. It's interesting and weird in its own kind of way, but it's something that I wanted to talk about because even when it comes to diets, there is geopolitics that is involved and a history of how things came to be. If there are any other kind of interesting, very specific things that you all want me to go and address, please let me know in the comment section below. I'm looking at adding on a lot more different things that I'm planning on touching. So if you could, again, like, comment, subscribe, let me know in the comment section below. I will see you all here next time, my friends. Thank you and goodbye.